It was 1 year ago in November 2018 that I started a viewer-requested tour of my complete comics collection. I did not know what I was getting into and how long it would take. Over the last 12 months, I've covered 14 different bookshelves in independent episodes, and they've been anywhere from 9 minutes long to 45 minutes long. Some of these shelves were really challenging to do. Shelf 7 was a challenging one, Shelf 9 was a challenging one, but the almost final Shelf 15 is perhaps the one I've been intimidated by the most. Shelf 15 is a sentimental favorite of mine because of the range of books as well as the role that these books play in my personal chronology of comics reading. It's absolutely bursting at the seams, not just in these top 2 shelves, but the 3 below it as well. As a shelf, this is a twin of Shelf 12, 5 sections, and these 5 sections, with the exception of manga and superhero comics, contains the widest range in terms of fiction, non-fiction, autobiography, journalism, fantasy. It also contains some formats and editions that I really love. And because it's so jam-packed with favorites and editions that I could say so much about, I've been putting it off till the very end. In just a minute, I'll pull the camera closer and start going through this shelf section by section, book by book. And to keep things interesting, at the end of every section, I'll poll you on which books you'd like to take a closer look at. Now that we are almost at the end of this year-long shelf tour, it's time to finally take a look at Shelf 15. The first books in the first section are volumes of the excellent medieval fantasy series Mouse Guard. This wonderful series by writer-artist David Peterson imagines a world in which mice, having only predators and no natural protectors, have to end up being their own protectors, have involved a sort of medieval culture to keep themselves safe from a world full of threats. The Mouse Guard are the forces that protect the farmers and the merchant mice. This is volume 1, Fall 1152, which was followed by Winter 1152. And then Volume 3, The Black Axe, which is a prequel. Over here is the hardcover box set of Legends of the Guard, the anthology series connected to the world and the universe of Mouse Guard, but with guest writers and artists. These volumes here are more Mouse Guard. These are 2 free comic book day volumes brought out by Archaea Press, the publishers of Mouse Guard. These are handsome hardcovers with ex libris plates, and contains sampling of not just Mouse Guard, but also Labyrinth, The Dark Crystal, and other Archaea series. Not all of Archaea's FCBD books are these hardcovers. The early ones are in the same format as these original issues. So this is Mouse Guard Volume 1 and I think Volume 2 in single issues. And I have a bunch of others, including Legends of the Guard issues and FCBD issues elsewhere in this apartment. All of the Mouse Guard FCBD stories have been collected into this volume, Baldwin the Brave and Other Tales, an original comic-sized hardcover. If you can't tell already, I'm a huge fan of Mouse Guard, and I'm definitely going to be making a series of videos on this excellent, excellent comic. Then we have 2 volumes of Kate Beaton, published by Drawn and Quarterly, collecting her webcomics, Hark a Vagrant and Step Aside Pops. If you have not yet made yourself familiar with the hilarious webcomics of Kate Beaton, I strongly recommend you head over to harkavagrant.com, where you can read all of these for free online. History and literature prove a comedic goldmine for Kate Beaton in these books. The next book is The Best We Could Do by Thai Bui, a harrowing story of a family's journey from Vietnam to America. It's a work of comics autobiography, family biography, and archaeology. This is a powerful book that was very well reviewed and lived up to the hype for me. Another piece of family autobiography, Imagine Wanting Only This by Kristen Radtke. A book that I really enjoyed. It's not as powerful as some family autobiographies I've read, but its more low-key approach presents sadness and sorrow in a very non-melodramatic way, which I really appreciated. This is You and a Bike and a Road by Eleanor Davis, a delightful book that was a great pleasure to read, but this is a black and white and sketchier work in some ways than her more colorful and varied How to Be Happy, which I think we saw on Shelf 7. Aesthetics, a memoir, is the autobiography, or one of the volumes of autobiography of I. Brunetti, a mixture of prose and the experimental and rather savage comics that he is famous for. This is an unusual comic that I found by accident, but I've really loved. Little Tommy Lost by Cole Closser is a modern day Little Annie pastiche sort of work, which manages to find humor and drama in some old forms that I thought was quite remarkable. Don't be fooled by the way it looks. It's a completely contemporary work and extremely enjoyable if you're willing to give it a shot. AD, New Orleans After the Deluge by Josh Neufeld is a fantastic comic. I read an extract of this, I think, in Best American Comics, and I had to get the book. It's a real-life nightmare that has been brought across with great humanity and tenderness, and is a fine example of how intimate and journalistic comics can be at the same time. The Adventures of Venus by Gilbert Hernandez is one of Gilbert Hernandez's few works that is for children or young readers, but it does connect to the Palomar, the adult series of stories that he's been writing for over 30 years as well. Venus is related to some of the main characters, but the stories over here are completely delightful and standalone, and depending on how early you want to get someone started with the Hernandez brothers, this works wonderfully for kids. Then we get to this stack over here, comics that are sorted together primarily, like most of my comics collection, because of their size and format. So this stack over here comprises landscape format comics. First up is Noble Boy by Scott Morse, a beautiful comic done in a card book format. These aren't paper pages. And although it appears as a children's work, much like The Barefoot Serpent, which I think we saw on shelf 3, this is a grown-up, experimental, and yet very artistically, aesthetically pleasing comic. Scott Morse has illustrated a couple of other comics that I know, particularly I think one of the horror books with Dark Horse and Steve Niles. And I've loved his work so much, I need to find more books by him. This is the signed copy of Why Don't You Write My Eulogy Now, so that I can correct it, by Patricia Marks and Ross Chast, that I went back to the book table for after my indie comics at an indie bookstore video. I'd mentioned in the comments for that video that I needed to go back for this, and I did. Mr. Wonderful by Daniel Clowes, perhaps one of his most accessible and enjoyable comics by general standards. I think a lot of his characters tend to be not very pleasant. A lot of his situations tend to be very awkward. This isn't as much of a fairy tale as the title promises, but the characters are more likable, and the story, it's not as harsh as some of his other stories are, and I completely understand why for many people this is their favorite Daniel Clowes. The Adventures of Superhero Girl by Faith Erin Hicks is a delightfully funny and warm take on the superhero genre. I think this is another one of my print collections of a webcomic, and is an absolutely charming comic that makes for a great introduction to the works of Faith Erin Hicks. Fingerprints by Will Dinsky is one of those books I bought on a whim at a used comics store and was wonderful. I've never read anything else by Dinsky, but this book is a strong endorsement of his work. Another Daniel Clowes, Ice Haven. Both Ice Haven as well as Mr. Wonderful were originally serialized in the pages of 8-Ball, so you could buy the complete 8-Ball and get everything, but I really enjoy having these landscape format books collecting what used to be strips in his larger magazine. Speaking of strips, our next two books are You're All Just Jealous of My Jetpack and Baking with Kafka by Tom Gauld. I've talked a little bit about Tom Gauld in my top 10 science fiction comics, where Moon Cop makes an appearance, and these are collections of his newspaper cartoons. I think they're published in The Guardian, among other places. I've seen many of these get forwarded as memes or as Facebook posts. Hilarious, very witty, very smart. Tom Gauld is like the dream mixture of Chris Ware and Kate Beaton that I did not know was possible. Terrific stuff. I picked up Heck by Xander Cannon immediately after I'd read Top 10, which he worked on with Alan Moore. And this book that he wrote and drew himself really surprised me with where it went and how it ended up, starting with this sort of supernatural tinged adventure story, quite a lot of comedy in it, but ends up being something heartbreaking. Very surprising, very worthwhile. I believe this too was a webcomic like a couple of other books that we've seen on this shelf before this hardcover edition. I haven't read that many Linda Barry works, although I'm quite aware of her reputation. The Freddy Stories is one of the only books by her I own, and it's been a while since I read it. I remember being impressed, but not incredibly so, which is maybe one of the reasons why I haven't checked out more Linda Barry's stuff. And I know that she is a major comics voice. I've read a couple of books, including a volume of Best American that's edited by her. Maybe I should give this another shot or pick something else up. If you have something by Linda Barry that you'd like to recommend, let me know in the comments below. Sin Titulo by Cameron Stewart is a noir story that twists and turns, but is also very surreal. I think something in the blurb mentions David Lynch, and it's very reminiscent of David Lynch type of weirdness, doppelgangers. At times it's difficult to know what's going on, but I was compelled throughout and thought this was a really strong comic. I think this might be due for a reread and reevaluation to see if it still holds up. Shutterbug Follies by Jason Little is a book that I'd never heard of. I'd never heard of Jason Little before I picked this up in a bookstore. I found it quite entertaining. The art and the colors were pleasing, and the story itself was a charming and light little comedy. Then we have over here 4 issues of Chris Ware's Acme Novelty Company. These hardcover volumes are actually different installments of Chris Ware's long-running periodical. This, for example, is issue 17. This is issue 19. The Story of Lint is issue 20. And this is issue 16. There are 21 issues of Acme Novelty Company. Some are magazine-sized, some are pamphlet-sized. These 4 happen to be hardcover, landscape-sized books. I've definitely wanted to make a video showing each of the 21 issues in order, because right now they're scattered all over the apartment. And finally down here is Blue by Pat Grant. I read a glowing review of this Australian comic online and picked it up on the basis of that, and this was staggering. It's a speculative fiction with aliens, but really it's a tale of immigration and racism, and it's sort of the story of these poor kids whose town has filled up with aliens who just settle and live next to you. To use movie comparisons, it's a bit like Stand By Me, it's a bit like District 9. It's really difficult to describe, but just a lovely read. Alright, so we've ended section 1. I've said that I'm definitely planning on making a video on Mouse Guard, and I'm probably going to be making a video on Chris Ware. But what else would you like a closer look at? The newspaper comic hijinks of Kate Beaton and Tom Gauld, the personal autobiography of The Best We Could Do, Imagine Wanting Only This, AD After the Deluge, The Adventures of Superhero Girl. Heck, let me know what you'd like a deep dive or a special episode on in the comments below. Now let's move on to section 2. Section 2 immediately shows me that although I said there's no manga on this shelf, there is one volume over here that qualifies. Now, this one, A Distant Neighborhood by Jiro Taniguchi. This is the first Taniguchi I ever read. It's a Western edition translated in English, but also put into the more Western format with the spine on the right. This was a breathtakingly beautiful book, one of the few books that I've seen that truly harnesses nostalgia, which can be a crutch, but harnesses nostalgia to tell a meditative and reflective story. I loved this book when I first read it, and this led me to pick up more Taniguchi, which I've shown in some of my new arrival videos. This is Fran by Jim Woodring, which serves as both a sequel and a prequel to Congress of the Animals. Fran is a cast member of the Frank series of comics, Jim Woodring's surreal, adventure series, although it's really, of all the comics I've read, Jim Woodring is right up there as perhaps the most unclassifiable. His comics feel like dreams and nightmares, but also old-time cartoons with all kinds of cruelty as well as non-human behavior, which are strangely compelling. Fran is a terrific collection to his Frank stories, which I have in various formats, but nowhere near comprehensive. Another very original work is here by Richard Maguire. One of the most interesting and affecting experiments with the form of comics that I've read. The entire book has only one camera point of view, but flips between time periods, often overlapping on each other in panels that show different time periods, and this stretches back literally hundreds of thousands of years, as well as in the future. I'm not doing a great job describing this. This is one of those books that just has to be read to be believed. This is The Imitation Game, Alan Turing Decoded, a biography of Alan Turing by Jim Ottaviani and illustrated by Leland Purvis. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I often sing the praises of Jim Ottaviani, one of my favorite biographers and non-fiction comics writers. This book isn't with the other books on shelf 3, Primates and Feynman, because it's not published by First Second and is a different format, but is no less an achievement in biographical comics from a writer who just excels at it. Something completely different is Head or Tails Stories by Lilli Carre. This is a collection of Lilli Carre's dreamlike, fairy tale-like, painful and yet wonderful stories. I'm a big fan of Lilli Carre. I really wish there was more of her work out there. This is a collection of short stories which makes a great place to start reading her works. Evolution, the Story of Life on Earth, is a really wonderful, all-ages, science-based comic written by the person who wrote Clan Apis, Jay Hostler. I picked this up after reading Clan Apis, which is a terrific non-fiction but very interestingly done non-fiction account on the life of bees. I wanted to read anything I could by Jay Hostler. The fact that this was illustrated by Kevin Cannon and Xander Cannon, whose Top 10, Heck, and Far Arden I've really enjoyed, was just icing on the cake. If you can get your hands on it, I really recommend this. Don't think that this is a children's book or a dry, boring book. The same kind of inventiveness and cleverness that Hostler brought to Clan Apis is present in every single page of this book. A different kind of nonfiction, Ego and Hubris, the Michael Malice story by Harvey Pekar. This is a standalone volume of American Splendor, not a collection of stuff that was published in the singles or the magazines, and is the biography of not a very famous person, but someone that Harvey Pekar finds quite interesting, someone who's appeared in an American Splendor story as well. And this book is a perfect example of what makes Harvey Pekar so great. It's not a famous person, it's not a very influential person that Harvey Pekar chooses to write about. It's someone he knows, but who he finds interesting. And through this book, he makes us find him interesting as well, but not for the usual Hollywood type of reasons. If you're interested in Harvey Pekar and how he transforms the everyday and the mundane into compelling stories, this is a great book to try out. The Beats, A Graphic History, is an anthology which features the writing of Harvey Pekar as well as the art of Ed Piskor, but also other writers and artists as well. A compelling read, again, done in not very flashy fashion, but if you're interested in the beats and interested in some no-nonsense approach in comic storytelling to them, you can check this out. This is the second edition of 32 Stories by Adrian Tomine. The first was a regular bound volume collecting all of Tomine's self-published issues of Optic Nerve before Drawn and Quarterly started publishing them. And this is a terrific edition that actually collects them in the original zine format in a cardboard box. I far prefer this wonderful presentation to the regular book volume, but either edition will show to you the incredible leaps and jumps that Adrian Tomine made as a young teenager. Issue to issue, you can see his style evolving and his art getting more polished, his writing becoming more sophisticated. So if you're interested in the early stories of Adrian Tomine, or if you're interested in seeing how quickly and how radically an artist and creator can evolve, 32 Stories is a great case study or example. A paperback edition of Shortcomings, also by Adrian Tomine. This is a small little character study that is still biting and scathing about relationships and human behavior without getting into extreme levels of melodrama. Collecting a story that was serialized across 3 issues of Optic Nerve, Shortcomings is available both in paperback and hardcover, I found out later. Then we have some books by Rutu Modan in chronological order. They are Jamilti and Other Stories, a collection of her earliest works, including a story that introduced me to Rutu Modan in the pages of Best American Comics, after which I sought out this collection. Some are in black and white, some are in color, some are more compelling than others, but all of them show just what a wonderful storyteller Rutu Modan can be. By being particular in cultural contexts in certain ways, she actually becomes quite universal, which is really put on display in her follow-up works, the full-length Exit Wounds, which is both a very familiar road trip story and a very unusual one of cultural and family discovery. And those themes also resonate in The Property, possibly her most sophisticated and mature work till date. I get the feeling that there might be another Rutu Modan book out there that I've missed, and looking through the shelf right now puts that right up on my priority list to go hunt for. Then we have 2 books by Sarah Glidden. Her first book, How to Understand Israel in 60 Days or Less, which introduced me to this very unique and personal type of journalism. This is the first edition that was published by Vertigo. I believe it's now been reprinted by Drawn and Quarterly, who are also the publishers of her follow-up, Rolling Blackouts, Dispatches from Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Unlike Rutu Modan, who takes an insider's fictional perspective, we've got an outsider's non-fiction journalistic perspective on similar themes in a certain part of the world. Very interesting questions about the role of reporting and the individual and personal politics. These 2 books are a wonderful 1-2 punch introduction to a very unique voice. Blue Pills by Frederick Peters is a beautiful, sad and funny, artistically illustrated, sensitively narrated story of a relationship with someone who's HIV positive. This book doesn't seem to have the reputation it should in comic storytelling, both traditional and experimental, as well as in examining human emotions in complex situations. This is one of the finest comics I've read. Whether or not you're familiar with the works of Frederick Peters, who does have terrific range, I would strongly recommend seeking out and reading Blue Pills. Then we have 3 books by the husband-wife team of Mary and Bryan Talbot. This is Sally Heathcote's Suffragette, which is written by Mary and Bryan Talbot but illustrated by Kate Charlesworth, a wonderfully dramatized piece of historical comics, as is The Red Virgin and the Vision of Utopia, about a very unique character forgotten or rather erased by history. This is illustrated by Bryan Talbot, whose works I have long admired, and we've seen his Granville books, Alice in Sunderland, as well as The Tale of One Bad Rat on previous shelves. But my favorite of the collaborations between Mary and Bryan Talbot has to be their first work together, Daughter of Her Father's Eyes. A very unique take on biography, because this is split between the biography of James Joyce's daughter as well as the author Mary Talbot's father, who was a Joyce scholar. Mirroring the father-daughter relationship across the years is just one of the extremely clever and intelligent ways in which this story weaves back and forth. Themes of obsession, madness, family, and much more are tackled stupendously in this slim little work. It was after reading this that I decided that I'm going to seek out anything that these 2 decide to collaborate on. Not that I wasn't already a fan of Bryan Talbot's. Was She Pretty by Leanne Shapton is a classic graphic narrative which was out of print for a long time, but I believe that Fantagraphics has now reprinted this in a paperback edition. Not traditional comics with panels and speech bubbles, for example, and the story may not appeal to everyone, but I found it very honest and engaging. The Lagoon by Lilli Carre is a full-length, book-length work, unlike some of the collections we've seen, and I love this book. This is haunting and fairy tale-ish the way that most Lilli Carre is, and its unique art style just helps add to the atmosphere of not just gloom, but also sad beauty that underlies our lives. I really can't do justice to the storytelling of Lilli Carre in a video like this, but if you're interested in gentle, speculative fiction that feels timeless, I really can't recommend Lilli Carre highly enough. Thomas Ott's The Number 733042341536968, which I usually just refer to as The Number, is like Cinema Panopticon and other Thomas Ott works, a wordless comic This one full story and not a collection that twists and turns and creeps you out all the way to the satisfying ending. Very cinematic but uniquely comics at the same time. It reminds me a bit of the Darren Aronofsky movie Pi, although it's substantially different in most ways. Delphine by Richard Sala. This was the book that introduced me to the beautiful art and ghoulishly fun storytelling of Richard Sala. I read this in the original 4 issues of the Ignatz format comics. This is the hardcover collection collecting all 4 of them. I believe this would be easier to find than those 4 issues, although in a slightly smaller format. And this creepy take on the story of Snow White makes an excellent introduction to Richard Sala. It's sophisticated and adult, but also contains that vein of dark humor that runs through most of his work. Pick up any Richard Sala and I think you'll enjoy it, but definitely try to get your hands on Delphine if you can. And then at the end here, we have 3 books by Alison Bechdel. This is Fun Home, the famous award-winning, groundbreaking comic about her father and her father's suicide, which combines painful family history and psychoanalysis with some very funny, clever, and heartbreaking observations. This book has a terrific reputation, and it is very easy to see why. There's nothing quite like it even now. Which actually includes Are You My Mother, a follow-up book, this one about her mother. Although it's still unmistakably her, I did not find this to be quite as gripping as Fun Home, which is not to deny the craft in it. And the honesty of it is unmistakable. It's just, as an impressive an act of family archaeology this is, to me it's not as compelling as Fun Home. Still completely worth a look. And the last volume here is the essential Dykes to Watch Out For, a selection of comics from Alison Bechdel's long-running strip of the same name. I'd heard a lot about Dykes to Watch Out For. I'd seen a selection in Best American Comics, like with many of these comics on the shelf. But there are so many volumes and so many are hard to get that I thought the essential collection would be a good place to introduce myself to the series and then see if I actually want to go through collecting every volume I can find. It seems like a great series. I really do think I should collect those volumes. I just never run into them around here. So once again, what would you like a closer look at? Richard Maguire, more Jim Ottaviani, Harvey Pekar, the works of Lilli Carre, the works of Rutu Modan, the Bryan and Mary Talbot collaborations? Let me know in the comments below. I think Richard Sala is definitely going to get a video one of these days, and I definitely will want to cover Harvey Pekar and American Splendor. Just let me know which ones you'd like to see first. Now let's move down to section 3. The third section houses the majority of my Joe Sacco collection, whose journalism and nonfiction work I've admired for many years. Admired to such an extent that I have several copies of Safe Area Gorajda. This is the first copy I ever bought after reading this as a borrowed book from a friend of mine. The story of the war in Bosnia, along with Joe Sacco's Palestine, was a crucial read for me. And I was able to pick up this first edition, I think. I just liked the cover and I got it for very cheap a few years later. And just recently I picked up this special edition as I documented in a video. So now I have 3 editions of this book, which allows me to lend this one out to people who are curious about Joe Sacco. The other Sacco books on this shelf include Palestine, which I feature in my top 10 gateway comics, and along with Safe Area Gorajda was one of the first Joe Sacco books I read. I actually read both of them back to back. And this too is available in a variety of editions, including, I think, a special edition hardcover like the one we saw for Safe Area Gorajda. Notes from a Defeatist is a collection of early Joe Sacco works, shorter pieces collected across a variety of publications. Journalism is also a collection of shorter pieces, but this is a later book. The Fixer, a story from Sarajevo, is a shorter piece that works as a standalone read. And Footnotes in Gaza is probably his longest and most ambitious work, in which he uncovers a single incident that is barely recorded in history and does a fantastic job of uncovering what happened on that one evening through a series of interviews and first-person research. I think I've loved everything that Joe Sacco has done, but this one doesn't get talked about as much as some of his other works do, and it's really a breathtaking book. We've seen some other Kevin Huizenga books on other shelves, and this is Curses, a collection of work that he self-published and in other journals. Curses stars Glenn Ganges, Kevin Huizenga's alter ego character in most of these comics. And as I keep saying about Huizenga, he makes thoughtful and philosophical comics that are quite rare and very different from many other things that you would read. This is another issue of the Acme Novelty Library. This is number 18, like the ones in landscape format that we saw in the first section. This one is a hardcover cloth-bound volume. Fog over Tolbiac Bridge is a Jaques Tardi comic adaptation of a Leo Malet novel. This is the first of the Nestor Burma stories. Nestor Burma is a private investigator. Fog over Tolbiac Bridge is the first of 4 novels of Leo Malet's that Tardi has adapted. On shelf 7, we saw my copy of The Bloody Streets of Paris, which was my introduction to Jaques Tardi. This shelf has more Tardi below, also from Fantagraphics books, but this one is up here because it's not the same size as those. The Now of Brown by Glidden is a beautifully illustrated, very sensitive, quiet, and delicate book that is a gentle look at a very unusual girl and the way she navigates the world around her, the relationships she has and develops, and is really one of the most beautiful comics I've read, both in the art in illustration, but also in the beauty of the story, whose characters are so human and endearing in spite of their flaws that they stay with you long after you finish this book. A superb example of the gentleness and nuance that comics are capable of. These are 2 volumes from Drawn & Quarterly's The John Stanley Library. This is a collection of Nancy strips that he worked on. Beautiful comics, beautifully reproduced. And this is a volume of his Melvin Monster strips that I showed in one of my recent reads and new acquisitions videos. I bought both of these used, but they're such beautiful books that I do want to pick up more in this series if possible. I picked up both of these used because I wasn't sure I'd enjoy them, but they're so wonderful that I really look forward to collecting more volumes in each of these series if I can find them. Audubon on the Wings of the World is a beautiful biographical account that does a great job of telling the story of this explorer and illustrator. Since Audubon is really known for his stylish illustrations more than anything else, this is a fantastic way of showing how comics can do kind of storytelling that prose and film, while they might attempt it, would not be able to replicate in quite the same way. The Rabbi's Cat by Johann Sfar is also one of my top 10 gateway comics. If you're looking to get into comics as an adult, as a mature reader, this is one of the books that I recommend to almost everyone. This first English language translation collects 3 of the French albums of this witty and heartfelt little historical fantasy. The Rabbi's Cat has a second volume, The Rabbi's Cat 2, which bring, I think, 6 or 7 of these stories into English. I believe there are more still to be translated, which is very painful for me given how much I love both The Rabbi's Cat and The Rabbi's Cat 2. Then some books by Frederik Peters, who I discovered recently in the last couple of years. Sandcastle is a bizarre and surreal story that I enjoyed quite a lot. Pachyderm was the same way. And I really loved Ama, Volume 1, The Smell of Warm Dust, and Volume 2, The Invisible Throng. Very interesting and unique science fiction comic stories that I really need to find further volumes of to continue. These 4 books, along with Blue Pills that we saw in the section above, are a terrific showcase for the range that Frederik Peters has. High Soft Bliss by Gilbert Hernandez is a spin-off story from his Love and Rocket stories, focusing on one of his major characters. Sleepwalk and Other Stories is a collection of Adrian Tomine stories originally published in his series Optic Nerve. Bigfoot by Pascal Girard was a surprisingly wonderful read. I didn't know anything about this book. I picked it up on the basis of the blurb and the summary in the back and found it absolutely delightful. I need to find more books by Girard. Interior is actually a book I haven't finished. I started reading it in singles. I couldn't complete it that way and bought this collected volume, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. My wife, who has read it, thinks it's wonderful. Just So Happens is another wonderfully watercolor illustrated, like a couple of other books that we've seen over here, like The Now of Brown. Story of a homecoming, of assimilation, of being a stranger in a strange land, even when it's your homeland, telling a story of a Londoner who revisits Japan for a funeral. The setup may sound a little familiar, but the execution of the story is just wonderful. Fumio Obata is another one of those people who I've only read one book by, but would love to read anything else they do. Good Dog is one of those on a whim pickups at a bookstore that I ended up really enjoying. Told from the point of view of a dog and giving voice to animals within it, this is not only not a children's story, it's quite serious and sad. It has some violence and swearing in it, but it's also a terrific example of comic storytelling, not just in its panels and layout, but in the way that language works, in the way that communication between the species happens. I love finding books like this that no one talks about, but I think deserve a lot more attention for the craft and technique that they have. The Thrilling Adventures of Loveless and Babbage has been mentioned in my top 10 sci-fi comics, and I can't say enough good stuff about this. Heavily footnoted, extremely well-researched, but also very tongue-in-cheek look at the development of computer science, computer programming, the making of the thinking machine, and then going off into this sci-fi fighting crime alternate history story. Not only does this book marry fact and fiction really well, but it also makes for very entertaining storytelling out of some rather difficult scientific principles. Highly recommended to computer science nerds and sci-fi fans alike. The Gigantic Robot was actually the first Tom Gauld book I ever read. Very unusual, but also extremely affecting for something this sparse. This book was a perfect introduction to the person whose Moon Cop and collections of newspaper comics in section 1 of this shelf I was to later enjoy. On shelf 3, we talked a little bit about Moving Pictures by Catherine and Stuart Immonen. This is another collaboration by that husband and wife team, Russian Olive to Red King. Gorgeously illustrated, beautifully colored, but above all, very sadly and sensitively written. You really feel the tragedy and the loss that this story has, that it does in a very unusual way. I don't want to spoil some crucial things in the story, but it's not a plot twist type of story. It's really about a relationship and emotions and resonances within people. There's a lot of silence, and the last 1/4 of this book is actually block prose, which may put some people off, but I find this to be not just experimental but also very affecting. Stuart and Catherine Immonen have collaborated on a number of books, including some superhero books, but a work like this, much like Moving Pictures, shows you how wide their range is and what they're capable of. And the last books here are some books by twin brothers Gabriel and Fabio Moon. This is two brothers, a year-spanning saga of family and love and responsibility that I thought was extremely sophisticated and mature, done with some wonderful artwork and layouts. How to Talk to Girls at Parties, sometimes titled How to Talk to Girls at Dinner Parties, is their bubbly adaptation of a Neil Gaiman short story. And of course, then there's Day Tripper. Day Tripper is one of my favorite comics of all time. It's part of my top 10 gateway comics again. This is the old yellow trade paperback that I bought used when I had no idea what this book was. It originally belonged to Alexander Evans. I have since then got this deluxe edition in hardcover that I guess I've put it in plastic because I don't want the white to get dirty, which is my recommended way to read this book. But I still hold on to this trade paperback because I was lucky enough to meet brothers Bryan Moon at the New Delhi Comic Con some years ago. So it was this copy that I had them sign. So Joe Sacco and Bryan Moon probably are going to get dedicated videos at some point of time, but what about the rest? Who would you like to see, or which books would you like to see a closer focus on? The watercolor beauty of The Now of Brown and Just So Happens with their delicate stories, comics of Kevin Huizenga, the works of Frederik Peters, Catherine and Stuart Immonen books? Let me know in the comments below what you're interested in getting a closer look at. Now, on to section 4. Apologies for the bad angle on this shelf. I'm also going to make this quick because I just realized how long I've been taking, and because this shelf contains a number of books in series that I can talk about in greater detail in other videos, a couple of which I'm planning to make. That's because this section is dominated by two creators, Jaques Tardi and Rick Geary. Both of them are among my favorite writer-artists in comics, taking very different approaches to very different kinds of material, but both of them are very unique and have large libraries to explore. But the third thing on this shelf is what we'll start with, the classics illustrated comics I have. These two are amongst the earliest I ever owned. They're remnants from my childhood. I used to have several more, but The Three Musketeers and Kidnapped are the only two that have survived. I found out many years later that these were illustrated by Filipino artists who were brought over to work on American comics and also contributed to other comics I discovered later. In the 1990s, Classics Illustrated relaunched with some very interesting creators adapting classics of literature, and the imprint paper cuts reprinted many of them. Here we have what I've been able to collect of the paper cuts hardcovers so far, and I definitely want to make a video one day, probably Classics Illustrated. Are they any good? Very quickly, here's Call of the Wild, adapted by Chuck Dixon and Ricardo Villagran. Great Expectations, adapted by Rick Geary. Tales of the Brothers Grimm, adapted by Mazan, Chicold, and Philippe Petit. The Murders of the Rue Morgue, adapted by Morvan and Drouet and Corbean and Marcel. Here we have Oliver Twist, The Wind in the Willows, one of my favorite children's books of all time. Seeing a beautiful adaptation here. The Monkey God. Alice Through the Looking Glass, adapted by Kyle Baker. The Scarlet Letter, adapted by P. Craig Russell and Jill Thompson. Wuthering Heights, again adapted by Rick Geary. The Invisible Man, Rick Geary's third Classics Illustrated adaptation. And The Devil's Dictionary. I'm always on the lookout for more in this series. Surrounding these are other Rick Geary books. Housebound by Rick Geary, a collection of short pieces, a collection of Rick Geary's National Lampoon art, and his self-published book of murder. I can't say enough about how much I love Rick Geary's inimitable style, tongue-in-cheek gruesomeness, and I'm so glad to have so many books of his to read. As I am to have the works of Jaques Tardi being published by Fantagraphics, allowing me to read this French master in English. Right at the edge over here, I'm not going to attempt to get it out, is the box set of Goddamn This War and It Was the War of the Trenches, 2 World War I books by Tardi. This is West Coast Blues, New York Mon Amour, You Are There, Run Like Crazy, Run Like Hell, and Like a Sniper Lining Up His Shot. All of these are adaptations of other, usually prose works, unlike a couple of his other books we've seen on other shelves. And in between the Rick Geary and the Tardi is a stray Joe Sacco. This is But I Like It, very early stories of him being a roadie with a rock band. It has a lot to do with music. This is closer to Notes from a Defeatist than his more journalistic comics, but it's a great read nonetheless. And over here is the stack of the rest of my Rick Gearys. I've already got a video on all the books that comprise the Victorian Treasury of Murder series. Other books over here are the books from his Treasury of 20th Century Murder, all of them from NBM Press, as well as a couple of self-published books. So although I think I know the answer to this one, the question to you is, which would you like to see first? A video on the comics of Jaques Tardi or a video on the comics of Rick Geary? Let me know in the comments below, and now let's move on to section 5. And I'm going to be even quicker with the last section, primarily because I'm crammed into a really uncomfortable position right here on the floor, but also because I really want to make longer and more detailed videos on almost everything this shelf contains. They're also going to be extremely hard to get out of here. About half of the shelf is taken up by various comics by the Hernandez brothers related to their long-running series Love and Rockets. Locus and Locus 2 are omnibus collections of Jaime Hernandez's stories of Maggie and Hopi and that cast of characters in the pages of Love and Rockets. These 2 compendium volumes collect all of their stories from the first 2 series of Love and Rockets and are now out of print and hard to come by. Similarly, Palomar collects all of Gilbert Hernandez's Palomar set stories from the first series, and I believe a little bit of the second series as well. And the stories of some of those characters are continued in the stories collected in Luba. All of these stories were originally published in magazine format and are collected here by character and theme and author. Marble Season by Gilbert Hernandez is a standalone story, an all-ages warm and fuzzy nostalgia-tinged read. This is a chronological collected volume of some of Jaime Hernandez's Maggie and Hopi stories, as is the Love Bunglers, which is the collection of one of the most beautiful and poignant arcs from a later series of Love and Rockets, from the third series. Gilbert Hernandez's The Children of Palomar is related to the Palomar stories and is a collection of 4 stories originally published in a large Ignatz magazine format. And the last Hernandez brothers book on the shelf is Julio's Day by Gilbert Hernandez, collecting a story serialized in Love and Rockets New Stories. That's the third series. And the rest of the shelf is made up of various comics of Matt Kintz. I'm a big fan of Matt Kintz. You've seen Matt Kintz on other shelves, and over here we have some of his earlier stories. This is the first volume of Pistol Whip. This is the second volume. This is a single issue of Pistol Whip, all of which have been collected together in the Collected Pistol Whip right over there, which is a new addition to my collection. It's a newly colored version of these black and white stories in a nice hardcover edition from Dark Horse. Two Sisters is related to his Super Spy universe. Revolver is a standalone graphic novel that he published with Vertigo Comics. These are 4 volumes of Department H, a recent series of his that I really enjoyed. And these are the 6 hardcover collected volumes of Mind Management, one of my favorite works of Matt Kintz. Everything over here deserves its own special video, just like some of the other Matt Kintz we have seen, and right on top of that list is Mind Management. So for this section, would you like me to explore the works of the brothers Hernandez or Matt Kint first? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave me a like to let me know. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll catch you at the next video.